Welcome to Prescribing Prosperity with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos from MedWealth Financial Services, operating through IPC Securities Corporation. In this podcast, we provide unique insights into wealth management, the psychology of financial decisions, and help listeners place the capital markets into perspective. Our aim is to help physicians, business owners, and other medical professionals to live their dream. Life is to live and enjoy, so we'll also cover health and lifestyle-related topics such as food, dining, travel, and unique experiences. Learn how global trends shape our investment strategy as we help you assemble your roadmap to prosperity.
And welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity podcast with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos. As many of you know, at MedWealth Financial Services, John and Alex specialize in providing wealth management services to physicians, business owners, and medical professionals. In addition to discussing financial topics, they also enjoy lifestyle subjects, including food, health, and leisure. And this week, we are excited to discuss all things wine, thank goodness, with our special guest, Gianluca Di Loro, winemaker, sommelier, and territory sales manager at Lifford Wine and Spirits. Gianluca, welcome. Good to see you. Glad you could be here.
Thanks for having me here.
Really quickly, before I throw you to the wolves, John and Alex, give us a really quick background. You came to Canada via Sicily, which seems an unlikely journey.
Sicily in 2019, roughly. I've been here for almost 4 years now.
Well, welcome. I'm going to let the guys get into the discussion about all things wine. And with that, John and Alex, I turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill. Gianluca, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So tell us a little bit about your background. So obviously, Bill just gave us a brief introduction that you joined us in Canada in 2019. But tell us about your career. You know, how you got started in winemaking and what brought you eventually to Canada by way of first Australia and then eventually into the Niagara and BC regions.
So basically, started my career as a basically cellar hand in Sicily. I did my first two harvests there, actually, in two wineries there while I was studying winemaking. And like I mentioned before, winemaking for me was almost an excuse to explore a little bit more than the island has to offer. So that's why I started studying winemaking, going to Piedmont, which is already kind of like living the country for a Sicilian, believe it or not. And then after I graduated in Piedmont, I moved to Lisbon. I got a master's degree in winemaking there. And I went to work on my thesis in Reims, which is a region in Champagne area. So I did my thesis on alternative use of bentonite, which is a clay that's very useful for protein stability in white wines, the production of champagne, of course, as well. And after that, I moved to California for my first harvest, and I really liked North America, like since always, because I usually like basketball fan. I used to follow NBA, and I love that North American culture as well. So I thought it was a very interesting new experience for me, other than just winemaking.
So Gianluca, you came at the right year then if you like basketball.
I came actually the perfect year. It was actually insane because when I moved to San Francisco, that was the year that the Golden State Warriors won the championship. And then I moved to Canada and the Raptors won. So
2019, that was a great year.
Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, it was the Raptors beat the Golden State Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of fun.
In Golden State, too. They closed down Oracle Arena. That was the last game ever played in Oracle Arena. Yeah, the Raptors won the championship there.
The first game I've ever watched was Golden State versus Los Angeles Lakers. So that was
very nice. So you saw Kawhi Leonard.
No, Los Angeles Lakers, Dad.
Oh, yeah.
Kawhi didn't play for...
Kawhi hadn't left yet.
LeBron would have been who he was watching. That's great, Gianluca. So then after you were in California, after that, what was your journey from there?
So after California, I went to Australia. I was in Perth, so Margaret River, Western Australia. Beautiful wine regions, lots of Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay growing there. And then the reason why I moved to Canada is because I was studying for a wine course called WSET, and there are different levels, and one of them, which is the last one, the level 4, you can only take in certain major cities. And one of these major cities is here in Toronto. That's why I decided to move here.
Okay, very nice. And then we met Gianluca at our golf club. There was a wine and food night where they hosted a whole bunch of wine importers who came in, brought some different wine selections for everybody to sample, as well as hosting some different food stations curated by the chef at our club. And so Gianluca was there, and I happened to stumble across him and got engaged in a nice long conversation. My wife and I, we both love wine and learning about wine, and so it was great to talk with Gianluca. And as soon as we left, I said to my wife, I said, we got to have him on the podcast once we get up and running, because he's going to be great. He knows a lot, and I love to talk about wine, so it was a perfect match.
You tricked me. I had no idea you had a podcast, though.
It wasn't started yet. We only launched a couple of weeks ago, and so it's still in its infancy. So you get to be one of our first lifestyle-related guests, or you are our first lifestyle-related guest. So it's a big honor for you, Gianluca. I hope you know that.
I appreciate it. I'm very privileged.
So tell us a little bit about this season for wine. How were the temperatures this year, specifically in the Niagara region? It was a bit of a cooler summer in the GTA. What was it like in Niagara?
Yeah, it was actually a pretty good season, to be honest. It's still going for most of the varieties. I believe so far most wineries have only picked grape for traditional metal sparkling, or these grapes need a little bit higher acidity. But overall, I think it's been a really good harvest, because a really good vintage, because temperature been ranging between like 20 and 30 degrees, which is the perfect ripening temperature, because above that grapes kind of shut down, and below that there is not much photosynthesis going on. So that's the perfect ripening range. Grapes are a little bit more behind compared to like warmer vintage such as 2020. But yeah, it's been great so far. We got some rain as well in the early stage, but now seems to be a couple of like longer days without rain. So that should be pretty good for the grapes this year.
Perfect. And just before I turn it over to my dad, I just wanted to ask you, so in terms of the harvesting season here in Ontario, I know in France, and the reason why I mentioned France is because Niagara is at the same level of latitude as the French wine region, I believe Bordeaux specifically, if not Burgundy, but actually I think it might be Burgundy. Anyway, the reason why I asked is because I know in Burgundy they harvest in August. So what is the traditional harvest season here in Niagara in Ontario?
Well, it depends. Here, there are many factors that have an impact, and that's a very different situation that in Europe, because here we have more a continental climate rather than Mediterranean climate, or even some mainland or inland regions in France have some closer climate to here. But the difference is essentially the varieties that they grow. For example, in Burgundy, you have mostly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, almost exclusively Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which are early ripening varieties, which means that they genetically are designed to ripe earlier. They need basically they need to accumulate a little bit less heat in order to be fully ripe. Here we grow a little bit of everything. That's why our ripening season is a little bit more extended. So we grow basically, and we're kind of blessed in Niagara because we're able to grow anything from Pinot Noir up until Cabernet Sauvignon, which is completely crazy if you think about it in French, like speaking about French region, right? Like France, Cabernet Sauvignon in Bordeaux and Pinot Noir in Burgundy. I don't think there is a single vine of Cabernet Sauvignon growing in Burgundy.
Yeah, it's sacrilegious to do anything but the traditional methods in Burgundy. That's for sure, in France in general. So I'll turn it over to Dad. Go ahead, Dad.
Well, it's been an interesting conversation so far. We want to get an idea, Gianluca, where do you hope to go with your career moving forward?
Honestly, I get that question a lot, and I ask myself the same questions, but I still haven't come out with an answer.
That's okay. So you're taking it one day at a time.
I think like I have many goals that I want to achieve, and the main goal is to keep traveling for sure. But I think I will stick around for a while in Canada just because this place really offers a lot of opportunities. And I mean, wine-wise, that's basically a wine heaven here because you can really grow anything you want and successfully.
But do the Europeans recognize how good the Niagara wine region is? Or has it found recognition yet in Europe or not yet?
Unfortunately, I don't even think that Canadian recognize that because the main issue that I experience daily when I visit restaurants is that 90% of the crowd hates or like has a really bad reputation or a bad like image of Niagara, and I really don't understand why. Because like in any other region in the world, like we should be a lot like everyone is proud of their region of their wine, and I think Niagara for sure is a young region, and probably winemakers tend to do a little too much in terms of what type of technique to use and how much experimentation there is going on here. But definitely Canadian wine has improved a lot. Even in the past 4 years that I've been here, I saw so much improvement and evolution in wine. And I think Niagara is able to compete easily with any other wine region worldwide. We have today like really, really great winemakers and really great grapes and wines here. We can really compete with any other wine region worldwide.
What do you think needs to change here domestically for the Niagara wine region and perhaps other wine regions in Canada, such as in BC? What needs to change, or how is the message going to get out that this is top quality, world class wine and wine growing here in Niagara?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that there are two main things that need to change. One is for sure being able to communicate wine better, because I think that even if the wines are great, you have to be able to spend a little bit more time communicating them. And I think that happens really, really well in Niagara. I think all the region in Niagara is equipped for wine tourism, and there are a lot of tours going on. And when tourists go to Niagara, want to drink Niagara wines, and it seems that when they come back to Toronto, everyone becomes snobby, and that's probably because of the training of most of the sommelier in this city, and that's something that unfortunately I see a lot. There is almost like bragging about France and Italy, and I'm saying that as an Italian. I love Italian wines, but I think there are certain wines in Niagara that are on par, if not better than most other Italians. So I think we should have a little bit more an open mind when we go to a restaurant and try also Niagara wines. But also on the other side, I think that needs to be almost attributed to the winemakers, because I think Niagara being such a young wine region needs definitely to have a little bit more focus on producing actually classic wines, which means wines that are clean, without anything funky going on, fair, like you can experiment and you can do things a little bit differently. But first, being a relatively young wine region, you should be able to prove the world that you're also able to make serious wines. And by serious wines, I mean wine that are respectful of certain techniques where wines has been made for years. For example, using classic varieties and make them in a classic way. Let's say Chablis style Chardonnay, or Bordeaux style Cabernet Sauvignon, Burgundy style Gamay Noir. So wines that are respectful of also that heritage. Or I will never do, like sometimes I speak with winemakers and they are making crazy things, like, I don't know, skin contact Chardonnay aged in amphoras and then 3 months in barrel and 5 months in bottle, and then I don't know, like crazy stuff. And I'm like, dude, who are you trying to impress? Like, try to follow a logic, right? So like, I think first of all we should be able to prove that we can make good wines, and then we can try to reinvent the wheel. Otherwise,
Right.
nobody's taking you seriously, or it's going to be really tough for you to communicate that wine. Right?
So establish the foundational classic wines that have already been in production for centuries, and then do something different is what you're essentially saying.
That's exactly. I think whenever I taste wine, or whenever anyone tastes a wine, and I'm able to blind taste it, which means to understand what wine I'm drinking, it's not because I'm a really good wine taster. It's because the winemaker was good at communicating it and respect the variety, making it able for the wine to get through your palate and actually communicate a territory, a region, or a style, right?
Absolutely. I just want to chime in here because, and I definitely agree with what Gianluca is saying. Wine should tell a story. And I think it's important that the wine is authentic to the story of the region, like you said, as opposed to trying to be sometimes overly creative. I think one of the other issues with the Niagara wine region is because, as with any wine region, in its infancy, the wines are going to taste young. They're not going to taste the same quality as they are in a region where the vines are more mature and are going deeper into the soil and therefore able to pull up more nutrients and more and find greater flavor varieties because of the richness of the soil that they're reaching. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it too is to finish that point, the fact that they were young for a period of time. A lot of people have an impression built on Niagara wines based on that flavor profile that they tasted 10, 15 years ago and say, well, Niagara wines aren't any good. Well, they've matured since then. It's not a static beast. It evolves. And so the quality of the Niagara vines have changed dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. And part of that is going to be a re-education process, like Gianluca mentioned, through the sommeliers, because they're the ones who guide everybody to what wines to choose. And people tend to gravitate towards the ones that they know. They know that France is a great wine producing region. They've been doing it for centuries. Same thing with Italy. Same thing with Spain. Like you're gonna gravitate towards those because you know that those are the high quality producers, and it's up to the sommeliers to guide the wine consumers to say it's not just these. The Niagara wines are excellent quality too. I think the other component that needs to evolve is the distribution. A lot of times the best wines in Niagara are the ones that come from the smaller producers. And so the smaller producers, when they go to distribute their wines, because they don't meet the requirements of the LCBO, which is the distribution channel within Ontario for liquor and wine, as well as beer, although there's also the beer store. The LCBO has certain requirements for production quantity. And so a lot of the better wine producers, because they don't have the capacity or the volume to be able to meet those requirements, don't actually retail through the LCBO. And so the education suffers as a result. People aren't able to try the best wines in Niagara because they're not available at the LCBO. You need to actually go to the vineyards or join a wine club in order to be able to obtain those wines.
Gianluca, what are your thoughts on the comments Alexander has been making for the last couple of minutes?
No, it makes total sense, and I completely agree with him. And also the reason why most smaller producers are not at the LCBO is because LCBO charges crazy amount of taxes on it. And that's why it's kind of discouraging for a winemaker or a small producer that wants to expand his audience. And honestly, it's not even convenient because if you already pay roughly 30% of taxes selling direct to consumer. But if you have to sell to the LCBO, it's something stupid. It's like, I'm talking about like 40% or more, 50%. I'm not exactly sure how much, but definitely it doesn't appeal anyone to give 50% of the profit.
Sorry to interrupt. I just I'm shaking my head while you're speaking. I'm thinking, boy, there's news. We are overtaxed here in Ontario and Canada. Especially where?
Southern Ontario, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Southern Ontario.
Yes,
for sure. Yeah, we'll get more into the distribution side in a little bit.
Gianluca, we know a little bit. Alexander knows more than I do, but tell us about becoming a sommelier. What's involved in the education process? How many tiers or levels of sommelier are there?
So, becoming a sommelier, it's like you can really follow many different paths. You can, I would say the most common two are internationally, CMS and using WSET, which is CMS is a Court of Master Sommelier, and WSET is basically Wine and Spirit Educational Trust. So these are two different paths, I will say, but basically, what you do with CMS, CMS is more based on service focused, I will say, while like WSET is more marketing and production focused. So when you talking about CMS, we're talking about like 4 tiers. There is introduction, there is certified sommelier, there is advanced, and there is master sommelier. While with WSET, there are also 4 tiers: first, second, third, and level 4 or diploma. And basically, the main difference, I will say, is CMS, other than focusing mainly on service, it's mostly self-study, while WSET, you can actually participate to classes. The first and second level, I don't think there are any classes. The level 3 and level 4 are a little bit more intense. Level 4 lasts 2 years, so it's pretty intense, and it's, I will say, comparable to the CMS advanced level, which will be the 3rd level for Court of Master Sommelier. But then there are many other ways to become a sommelier. There are sommelier that have been just practicing and studying independently without taking any exam. But they've been working in restaurants for their whole life. Or there are other, probably regional, if we can call them that way, wine courses or like university.
So which path have you been following?
I did WSET. So I just finished my diploma, actually.
Can you elaborate on what that acronym means?
WSET means Wine and Spirit Educational Trust. And it's a London-based school, but it's international, so it's worldwide. Okay. So I did WCT, and I actually applied for the MW program, which will be the Master of Wine program. That's basically also a UK-based school, a London-based school, and that's comparable in terms of difficulty, I would say, to the last level of the Court of Master Sommelier, which is becoming a master sommelier or a master of wine.
So how many levels are there?
It's 4 per each. So 4 for CMS and 4 for WSET.
And what does CMS stand for?
Court of Master Sommelier.
Okay. What level are you at presently?
So I just finished the diploma path. So I applied for Master of Wine now, which is basically other 3 years program. So if everything goes well, which it's almost impossible for everything to go well the first attempt. Consider that I think the pass rate is less than 1%. So
which level are you referring to?
That's the Master of Wine, which comes after the WSET diploma.
Okay, but you said there's 4 levels, right?
Yeah, Master of Wine is, I will say, a 5th level, but it's not the WSET. It's a different school, but you need to have at least the diploma to be able to access that.
Right. Okay. So would you say you're qualified at the 4th level at the present time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So you're very advanced at this point.
I will say, yeah, I'm up there.
Okay. And the now explain the how sensitive your taste buds need to be in order to be able to pass the highest level.
Honestly, I don't think at all that is I have a special sensitivity. I think anyone can become a great wine taster, but it's more based on how much knowledge you have and how much theory you actually know. Like you could possibly taste blindly a wine without even ever tried wine before, or even ever tried that wine before. I mean, if you think about it, there's so many wines, and it's almost impossible for a sommelier to try them all. But if you know what a Pinot Noir from Burgundy is supposed to taste like, you are able to identify that in the glass almost certainly. It's a little bit more tough to identify what producer. It's almost impossible to identify what producer because there are many variables that take place in making wine, right? Maybe the winemaker was feeling extra generous that year and add a little bit more barrel in the blend. You know what I mean? But overall, it's pretty easy to taste wine and kind of identify what the wine is just by having a really wealthy knowledge of or like background of that region. That's pretty much like the approach that most sommelier use when they do a blind tasting, which is almost incorrect to talk about blind tasting because it should be called more like deductive tasting, just because when you taste a wine and you're trying to figure out what you're tasting, you basically go, or you should go through a process of exclusion. So basically you say which grapes have, first of all, you look at the wine, right? So you basically, whenever I taste a wine, I go through a process that's basically sight, nose, and palate. So the sight gives you certain information, the nose gives you other, and the palate gives you other more. So if you first assess the sight, if you first assess the sight of a wine, you're like, oh, this wine is purple EU. Which grapes have purple color? And you think about Malbec, so it can be Pinot Noir, it can be Nebbiolo. So you go through the second step, which is the nose, which wine tends to smell like flower, and you can eliminate a bunch of other grapes, which wines they have really rich tannins. So at the end, you narrow it down to 2 or 3 varieties. And then,
deductive reasoning.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lot easier than it looks. Like nobody has a magic palate. Of course, your palate and your brain tend to associate certain flavor with certain areas, certain wines, and you can train that and you can become slightly more sensitive. But it's mostly like if you don't have the theory of the theoretical background, you can taste wine all day for 100 years. You still won't be able to figure out what it is.
Right.
Right. That makes sense. Now, Gianluca, I wanted to ask you a question about your own wine. So I know in the past you've worked as a winemaker. Do you currently have your own label that you're producing, or is the production that you're working on right now through your consulting business, where you're consulting with other wineries on their labels?
So right now I'm basically producing my first vintage this year, and I'm making a Chablis style Chardonnay, fresh, crispy, high acidity. But no, it's not out yet. Hopefully, we'll be ready probably end of February, March 2024.
Okay, excellent. So a little bit more mineral than the strictly buttery Chardonnay that we tend to get a lot of times.
It'll be a lot mineral, fresh, high acid, and we'll see. We'll see if I go through malolactic conversion or not. because that's what kind of gives that butteriness and creaminess other than the barrel aging. Yeah. But I don't think I'm going to use any barrel.
So you think you'll go with stainless steel aging as opposed to a barrel age? Nice. Excellent. Well, we've kind of dovetailed nicely into our next topic, which is specifically about production in Ontario. So you've touched already a little bit on the temperature requirements that we need to have in order to produce wine in Ontario. That being, between 20 and 30 degrees Celsius is the optimal temperature range. What are the other important factors that play into good wine production? I know, soil is one, water or rainfall, I should say. Why don't you elaborate a little bit on some of those?
Yeah, factors? I would say the most important too, which, like you mentioned, the soil definitely plays a role. Temperature needs to be around 20, 30. But what matters more than temperature is something called GDD, or like growing degree days, which essentially is a measurement of the heat accumulation that is required for every specific grape to achieve ripening, a full ripening, right? So that's something that it's almost mandatory for a wine region to be able to call itself a wine region. And another thing is water, which means a certain amount of precipitation per year, roughly around 750 minimum for grapevine, for Vitis vinifera. And in Ontario, we have plenty. We have probably 1,000 to 1,200 millimeters of rain per year. So that's why it's almost too much. And that's why the best soil are soils here in Ontario, where you have a lot of sand, where the sand component plays a big part, because sand allows free draining, right? So allows the roots not to be stuck underwater and have a little bit more oxygen, allows also better the organic matter to be mineralized, which basically means oxidized and being actually available for the roots to have access to. And that's why most people speak highly about the bench area. There are two, I will say, main sub-region within Niagara. There are the bench area, or closer to like the escarpment, and there is Niagara on the Lake. Niagara on the Lake, it's definitely more flat, but luckily for them, it's a little bit more sandy in general. And then there is the bench, which is a little bit more hilly and a little bit higher altitude, roughly. And this is also very important, because one of the main problem, I would say, in Niagara is that we're almost too blessed, because there is everywhere it's flat, right? And when you have flatlands, all the organic matter that even falls, there is no erosion, basically. So you have a lot of fertility, very fertile soil, though, shift that vine balance from ripening towards more vegetation phase. So doing that, basically, vines almost delay their ripening, because tend to produce a lot of leaves, a lot of the vegetation, rather than focusing on actually ripening the grapes. And that's something that needs to be understood, and that's probably one of the main challenges, because for sure, as a grape grower, you have the potential to ripe a lot of grapes in terms of quantity, but the quality is also related to that. So if you want to make high quality wine, you have to understand that you need to renounce to quantity and focus on ripening a little bit less grapes. If you think about it, all the best wine region in the world are regions with very, very poor soils, because when the vines struggle to ripe, or when the grapes struggle to access the nutrients and the water that they need, they tend to produce smaller berries, which this has a huge impact, because smaller berries means that the skins, which is the part of the berry that has all the noble substances that are important for wine flavor, all the anthocyanins or the tannins, the ratio between the skin and the pulp, which is basically just sugar and water, it's very, very high. So that's why you have very flavorful wine in very poor soil. And that's why the biggest mistake you can do in most areas. Now, I don't want to generalize because there is also patches when you have like lack of nutrients in Niagara, but usually the biggest mistake that you can do is irrigate to try to produce more and fertilize, because you're just going to delay ripening and risk then not to having enough time or enough heat in the fall to bring ripening to completion, to finish ripening, right?
Gianluca, sorry to
that's
interrupt,
why,
Alexander. I just he triggered a thought to me. How does the soil in Niagara compare to a place like Bordeaux, which also gets a lot of rain?
Niagara has a very different soil, like in their different regions. Like I said, Niagara on the Lake tends to be very sandy. At least the vineyards where I've been working, there is actually a specific winery, a specific plot on that winery. And I can even mention the wine. I'm really friend with the owners there, from Cellars. They have a crazy spot with red sand, and they grow Cabernet Sauvignon there. While there's a little bit more clay in the bench area. So that's an area where temperature tend to be, and climate in general, like tends to be a little bit cooler, not only because it is at higher altitude, but also clay implies that water is retained a lot more than sand, and water slows down change in temperature in the soil. Because if you think about it, when there is a lot of porosity in the soil, you have a lot of air going through, and air warms up and cools down a lot faster than water just because it's less dense. So the same happens in the bench. That's why also the varieties that are grown in the bench are generally different than the varieties.
And can you contrast that with Bordeaux? What's the situation there?
Well, Bordeaux, also you have right bank and left bank, right? So in the left bank, you have a lot more like Merlot, more clay based, while in the right bank, the opposite way. You have a lot more Cabernet Sauvignon in sand, right? In Medoc, for example. So that's why Cabernet Sauvignon is a more exigent variety in terms of heat. So you need a lot more sand to ripe Cabernet Sauvignon compared to Pomerol, for example, where you grow mostly Merlot, and that's more like clay-based soil. Because Merlot is an earlier ripening variety, so you need less heat, both in the air, I would say, outside the soil and underground in the roots.
Thank you.
So you so Cab Franc and Pinot Noir would be are generally more growable on the bench. So they turn out better on the bench than they do in Niagara on the Lake.
Yeah.
So that's all fascinating, Gianluca, because I was also going to mention, you talked a little bit about the fact that irrigation is a big challenge when it comes to producing the wines. In France, for example, you touched a little bit upon it. They don't allow any irrigation. It all is natural rainfall. So that way they force the vines to struggle and dig deeper into the earth in order to find more nutrients and more water underneath instead of relying on surface water. Talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, how rain impacts the harvesting season, because obviously you don't want to pick right after rainfall, but you might explain why that is.
Well, rain it can be an issue during harvest. Like obviously you don't want to pick during rain just because, or like right after the rain, because you tend to have a little bit lower brix. Brix is essentially the amount of sugar that 90% of the world uses established when grapes are ready to be picked. And if you have water just on the canopy or on the bunches, obviously you're gonna dilute the sugar content, which is gonna basically give you as a result a lower sugar level and a lower alcohol content in the wine. But in general, I wouldn't be too worried about that stage because that's basically like towards the end of harvest. You can just wait one day and pick after when the grapes are ripe. But what's very, very dangerous is if you already have some mildew and towards the end of the ripening where the skins are very soft and more rain is just going to make things worse, right? You're just waiting for the grapes to ripe and more rain will just feed the mildew and reduce the overall quality of the product.
And part of the reason why you want to ensure that you don't have too much vegetation, right? Because you don't want it to be too shady because you need the sun exposure in order to prevent mold and mildew from developing on the surface of the grapes.
Totally, you need airflow. And one other thing that I always tell vine growers here, the worst thing possible you can do in Niagara is also use herbicide because the best friend you should consider here to have is grass. Especially if you don't have grass, just use cover crops because grass it almost works as a buffer, not only with water, right? When you have excessive water, this water, instead of going to be absorbed by the vines and increase the LI, which is the leaf area index, so the amount of leaves and vegetation that you have. If you have grass is going to take care of it, right? So you almost it works as a perfect balance and competes with the vines, creating that competition that's going to eventually enhance. It's going to eventually enhance the ripening process. But if you don't have that, then it's going to be a lot less balanced. Moreover, when you have grass, you have more biodiversity, and this is also very important because biodiversity allows you to host insects that are predators of many other pests. So you basically have full control of the vineyards by itself instead of needing to use extra insecticide, or like there is almost no need of using insecticide in Niagara, but most people still do it. I guess the sales rep for insecticide are really good at sales, but
absolutely,
it's not required.
Yeah, and I think that's one big difference between the old world and the new world is the prevalence of pesticides and insecticides and their utilization here relative to places like Italy and France. But I'll ask you one last question, Gianluca, before we're going to move over to buying. I was going to turn it over to my dad. My last question was just going to be: are we seeing any trends in winemaking? Anything that is current in terms of the use of different winemaking processes, fermentation, barrel usage, barrel aging? Is there anything in particular that we're seeing as a current trend right now, either in Canada or abroad?
What I've seen and what I've noticed a lot that is there is almost a return to likely to less alcoholic wines. Like the wines that probably sell the least are fortified wines, such as port, and there's a lot more attention or wines. The most required wines are the ones with low sugar content. I will say almost like people are trying to look for healthier wines lately, if we can call them that way. So that's the main trend, I will say, in the market. And that brings, to answer your question in terms of winemaking technique, means in order to have less sweet wine or less alcoholic wines, you need to pick relatively early. So that's the picking time is really a big thing in winemaking. I will say 60-70% of a wine quality is it depends by when you pick the grapes. So you have to really focus on that if you want to make a specific wine, because picking the grape at the right time doesn't only give you a wine with a certain amount of alcohol, but what's more important is the amount of acidity that you have. And at the end of the day, a wine needs to be balanced. It doesn't need to be with 16-17% of alcohol, but no acidity. It doesn't really matter. It matters how balanced it is, that wine. So you always want to look for great flavor component, decent amount, and high acidity in order to be balanced.
That's really valuable information for people who have not spent as much time learning about wine as you have. Obviously, most people's experiences with wine have to do with walking into the LCBO here in Ontario or an independent liquor store in other parts of the world. What things should people look for when they're trying to determine if a wine is good or not?
Well, it's unfortunately it's always tough to judge a wine by the label, right? Almost, I would say. But there are certain things that you could use as clue to understand what would be a great choice. First of all, depends like what kind of event you're buying the wine for, and then there are certain wines that I think are usually a safe buy. When I'm talking about safe buy, I'm talking about wines that are classics. So wines that at least have an appellation in their label, such as I'm talking about Barolo or Barbaresco or Loire or any sort of appellation. Normally, you understand that the wine, not because it comes from that appellation, but because at least you know that in order to make that wine, the winemaker has to stick to certain type of rules, right? So that would be relatively safe. But also other things that you can evaluate when you're purchasing wine is price point. Doesn't necessarily mean that a wine that is more expensive than another is better than the other, because you have to understand that certain wines have in certain region a different price point for certain specific reason, right? For example, in order to drink really good Napa Cabernet Sauvignon, you really cannot spend $40. You have to spend a lot more in general, but you can get with $40 an amazing, aligoté from Burgundy, just because they're very different wines, and a lot of people are more familiar with Napa Cabernet Sauvignon. I think also this brings the price up, other than many other reasons.
So Gianluca, which particular region do you think offers people the best value for buying wine?
Well, the best value, definitely Spain. Probably Spain, yeah. But I mean, we're talking about Rioja. There are certain like Rioja that I don't even know why they sell it for like $25-$30, and they're really
taxes
wines. That's probably high in terms of price.
What
And aged Riojas too. Like we're not talking about, a 5-year-old Rioja. Like you can go to the LCBO and you can probably buy a 20-year-old Rioja for like $30. So it offers some great opportunity for sure.
For me, it's an insane Cava or Trento DOC. These are like certain like traditional method sparkling wine that can easily compete with champagne, and they're a tenth of the price most of the time.
What are your top three favorite regions to buy wine from?
3 favorite regions. That's a really tough question. Probably, I will say Barolo. I will say Etna. I love Etna Bianco, which is basically I call it the Chablis of Sicily. It's high acidity, fresh, crispy, and it's only made Etna Bianco Superiore. It's only made in a specific city called Milo, which is a super tiny village. I would love to drink Burgundy every night, but it's too expensive for me.
Okay, so the argument is settled. 2 out of 3 are Italian, so the Italian region is the best wine region in the world. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying
We have family members who have this argument from Italy, saying we're better than the French. No. Anyway, so what are tannins? We hear this word tannins. What are tannins, and how do they affect the wine consumption experience?
Well, tannins are basically, in like very simple word, they're just polymeric phenolic compounds. They're literally molecules that are able to polymerize, which means are able to bind other molecules. They're able to bind each other. And amongst the molecules that are able to bind, there are proteins, right? And the reason why they produce a certain effect in our palate is because they cause the drying sensation or the astringent sensation, which is essentially then buying the proteins in our saliva, the enzymes in our saliva, and precipitate them. So that's why they create that drying sensation.
So is that a good sensation to have when drinking wine?
Well, it is. It's part of the texture of the wine. It gives the mouthfeel to red wine. Basically, tannins are found in only certain parts of the grapes. They're found into the skins. They're found into the seeds, and they're found into the stems. So you won't have tannins in white wine unless that white wine has been in contact with the skin, but that doesn't really happen other than orange wine or few extra, few exclusive situation. But other than that, you won't have tannins in white wines. But in red wine, tannins are basically a very important component of the wine itself. There are certain grapes that are actually famous for their tannins. For example, Sagrantino in Italy is one of the most tannic varieties in the world, and also Nebbiolo is very, very tannic. Tannins also allow wine to stabilize their color because tannins are able to bind anthocyanins, which are basically very similar molecules to tannins. And they're able to.
These are all healthy ingredients. I know all these names. Anthocyanins. That's what gives the reddish, purplish, bluish colors in fruit. These are all good antioxidants. So you're giving us a reason to drink more wine.
It's also a byproduct, and Gianluca can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, it's a byproduct of skin fermentation in order to give color to the wine. So, like, for example, Cabernet Sauvignon is a red skin but white flesh, and so in order to get the reddish hue in the red wine, they skin ferment. Is that correct, Gianluca?
So every single red wine is produced with a process called maceration, right, or pump over or punch downs. Basically, pump over or punch downs are just techniques. They're meant to extract the anthocyanins, so the coloring matter of the skins, and you extract that with pump over, which means pumping over the juice from the bottom of the tank to the top where the cap is. The cap is basically where all the skins are found during fermentation, just because CO2 brings them up. And also temperature and ethanol, so alcohol, works as a solvent, right? Extracting the color from the skins. And that's how you have the creation of a red wine as opposed to a white wine from red grapes. For example, if you think about champagne, a lot of Blanc de Noir, it's made by separating the skins from Pinot Noir right away instead of macerating it, right?
Just very quickly, we're trying to be sensitive to time. I have a couple of questions that the average people have. Average people include me in that group. Decanting a bottle of wine? How long should a person decant a bottle of wine? And to follow up on that, why do some wines give people headaches?
So decanting a bottle of wine, it's rarely necessary, to be honest. Obviously, it's part of the experience when you go to a restaurant, but very few wines need to be decanted. Old wines or wines that have been bottled for a very long time usually need some decanting, but I wouldn't say more than 30 minutes. Also because like when you're in a restaurant, you don't really want to wait an hour or two for in order to enjoying a bottle. And usually if a wine, it needs to be decanted, which means has a little bit of stinky nose, just because it's been in a reductive environment for a very long time. Reductive environment means basically inside the bottle with lack of oxygen. You almost have that like rotten eggs type of aroma. So that's due to sulfuric compounds that develop in certain conditions. So once you decant that, quickly you're gonna have the wine breathe, right, and gives you that normal aroma, I would say, after you decant it. But very few wines need that process. And the other question,
The headache. Why do some wines give people headaches?
what causes a headache is essentially sugar and alcohol. Sugar because it creates quick changes in your blood pressure, and the second one, ethanol. It's toxic, right? So if you drink more than a bottle, you're most likely gonna have a headache, but not because the wine is bad or the sulfite. There are a few people that have problem with sulfur. They're allergic to sulfite, but it's really small amount of the population.
I see. And are older bottles of wine better than younger bottles of wine?
No, not all the time. Not in most cases, no. I think most wines are really good to be drunk between 5 and 10 years of their making. Certain wines can age or can change their flavor profile and their mouthfeel over time. But in general, I wouldn't age a wine longer than 20 years, even if it's one of the best Barolo or like Bordeaux or any other tannic wine.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. So we're just going to we're going to discuss a little bit about consuming wine. Obviously, the best part of wine, Gianluca. So one of the greatest experiences I had with wine was my wife and I. We were in New York City. It was probably about 5 years ago, and we went to a guided wine tasting with a sommelier, and they had about 5 or 6 bottles that they opened up for us. And what they did was with each wine, he let us smell it, and he let us taste it, and then he asked us, what do you smell? What do you taste? And then people would provide their input, and then he would respond and say, well, do you notice this? Or do you taste a little bit of this in the wine? And if you taste it on different parts of your tongue, how does that impact the flavor? And it was a very eye-opening experience for both of us to have that type of expertise. And so obviously not everyone has the benefit of tasting with the sommelier. So give us a couple of quick tips, if you don't mind, about what the best process is people should follow for tasting wine in order to maximize their enjoyment.
Well, so normally what I'll say is that whenever I'm enjoying a bottle of wine, I don't really taste it because I do that for work most of the time. But what I'm saying with that is like tasting as a proper technique, which means literally separating the wine almost into its components, which are basically sight, nose, and palate. So the color, the aromas, and the flavors in the palate. But they're all related to each other. But definitely what someone can do is, and I think that's why that's what a sommelier should do, and that's why what a wine educator should do, should try to guide the person that's first approaching the wine towards a better understanding of what he can find in that wine. And one of the coolest thing I've noticed doing wine tasting with other people, with other consumers, is try to point out why that wine is special for. For example, if you're trying Syrah from Northern Rhone, something that you can point out is black pepper aroma. Almost always you have black pepper aroma, and when you mention that, you already highlight that type of feature in that wine, and the consumer or the non-trained person is able to pick that up, and I guarantee you they will never forget that. When you're tasting a Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, most of the time you have guava or passion fruit aroma. And that's something that it's the process of association that you can do repetitively, and you can kind of like get a feel for that and become like almost used to it. So that's something that enhance definitely the experience of wine tasting. I find it very, very interesting, and a lot of people reaction when I mention like it doesn't really matter to mention or list 50 descriptors in a wine, and there is no right or wrong up to a certain limit, of course, but normally that's what I find really interesting, like when you're enjoying some wine, highlighting certain features that wine should be known for. That's something that really helps to make a really better experience.
For sure. So I want to ask one last question because I want to save time for our last topic, which is importing wine. Now, that's obviously something that's near and dear to your heart. But before we get to that, I just wanted to ask you, how does food pairings, or how do food pairings as well as glassware impact the experience and the flavor of the wine when you're consuming it? Does glassware really matter in terms of drinking it out of a red wine glass or a white wine glass, or ones that are specific to certain grape varietals? And then a follow-up to that is, how does food pairing go with wine?
I think glasses do matter just because, first of all, like drinking a good wine in a good glass gives dignity to the product. And I mean, winemakers spend years to build that up. So why would you not appreciate that and drink it in a plastic cup, or even worse, in ISO glass? So I think that's very important. But also certain glasses are meant for certain wines, because wines have aromas that are essentially volatile molecules, and they have different weights in terms of actually molecular weight. So certain molecules are heavier than others. And when you, for example, swirl a wine, the point of swirling a wine in a glass is to be able to push out of the glass heavier molecules that otherwise you wouldn't be able to smell. And there are studies that prove that these specific shape of glasses are able to enhance aromatic compounds in the wines. So yes, I would say definitely wine glasses matter. And the other question, the food and wine pairing, that's a totally other word. Like we have, we could spend talking about this in our podcast for years, for ages.
Okay, we'll save that for your return appearance on the podcast, Gianluca. How about that? We can do a whole podcast on just wine.
Let's do that.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So, Dad, I'll leave it to you then to talk about.
Okay. So, outside of the LCBO, one of the primary methods of purchasing wine is through an importer such as yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about Lifford Wine and Spirits and how your business works?
So Lifford is basically an import agency. Lifford, what we do is we import wine from a little bit everywhere in the world. We have a huge portfolio. It's actually the biggest consignment portfolio in Ontario, which means most of our wines are not found in the LCBO. And what I really like about Lifford is that all our wines are very classic and clean, and we have a lot of really iconic producers. And what we do is basically we import these wine gems and we distribute them to both private consumers, to hotels and restaurants. And my role basically there is mostly sales. So I have probably the dream job of any wine lover, which is going around restaurants and enjoy wines with the restaurant managers or sommeliers and chefs. And
sounds like a very good business. Don't talk about it too much, because then Alexander's going to leave my practice and come join you.
Hey, Alexander, I'd be happy to work with you.
Sounds good, John. Look, I'll forward you my resume.
Gianluca, Lifford, you said it imports wines from all over the world. Does that include Greece? I've heard that Greece is an up-and-coming wine region. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, Greece is way more than an up-and-coming. Greece is where basically, I will say, wine was born almost. I mean, winemaking almost like was born in like the Caucasus. So, and then like he moved towards Greece, and then from there he moved to Sicily and to North Italy, and then finally he made it to France. But yeah, Greece is a lot more than an up and coming. I love Greek wines. I love Assyrtiko, and there are so many. Vinsanto too. Like Greece is an insane place for grape. Sino Mavro, it's basically a cheaper Barolo. It tastes really, really good. And actually, in one of my exams, I was so disappointed because I blind tasted a Sino Mavro and I called it Barolo, and that was my the first time in my life
really?
I did Barolo. I was
wow.
I never felt that, and Zino Mavro had me fooled.
Vino Mavro.
Well, John, look, I hope you know I'm now going to need a bottle of wine because my dad's never going to let this go. That Greece is now also the birthplace of wine in addition to everything else.
That, but I had to have Alexander hear it from an expert. He was the ancient Greeks who planted the vines in France,
and even in Sicily. There is a lot of history of Greek. There is an island called Mosia that I believe that's a Greek settlement, and there are a lot of amphoras there and a lot of Greek vessels. It's insane place. Maybe one day when you guys come visit me in Sicily, I'll take you there.
Oh, that sounds fantastic, and then you've piqued my curiosity. Very quickly, how long can wine be stored for to reach its peak?
It depends what wine. I will say if we're talking about white wines, other than a few wines like Rieslings or a few Chardonnay, I wouldn't age any white too long, especially aromatic wines. If we're talking about red wines, it depends by what variety and what quality level. If we're talking about really tannic varieties such as Sagrantino, Aglianico, which is Taurasi, basically, which is a region in Campania, or we're talking about some Bordeaux or Barolo. These I wouldn't age longer than 20 years. Definitely will benefit from 10 years aging, but between the drinking window is between 10 and 20 years. Also because all of these wines tend to be corked, and by corked I mean they tend to have natural cork closure, which allows a little bit of oxygen access. And after that amount of time, also the cork becomes more friable and it's easier to be damaged. So we'll let more oxygen going through. So
what you're saying, Gianluca, is if we find a bottle of wine in a shipwreck in the Ionian Sea, and it's 400 years old, it's unlikely going to taste very good.
I will be surprised if it does.
I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question here before we let you go, Gianluca, and that's just how does aging the wine affect the flavor? How does it affect the experience of the consumer?
So that's basically a pretty easy question to answer because there are three main components, if we want to call them that way, aromas and flavors in wine, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary are the aromas that basically come from the grapes mostly, so fruity, floral type of aromas. And secondary are the ones that come from fermentations, so butter, creamy, this kind of aromas. And the tertiary are the ones that come from aging. So over time, what is going to happen that the primary aroma are going to tend to fade, and the secondary and tertiary are going to take over. So ideally, you want to drink the wine, of course, based on your taste. If you like fruitier wines, I will drink it as soon as possible. Because otherwise the dominant flavor are going to be tertiary and secondary aroma, just because you have also less primary aroma. So the wine becomes just more shifted towards secondary aroma, so nutty aroma or barrely aroma. But also the texture and the mouthfeel is going to change over time, because over time the tannins tend to combine each other, so they won't bind as much your saliva protein, which makes the wine smoother over time. And also what's going to change is the level of acidity slightly, but it's going to have an impact on the wine texture. Acidity. Yep.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what's the best way for the consumer to store wine?
Best way to store a wine is definitely in a dark place, consistent temperature between 12 and 15 degrees, no more than that. And humidity, it also plays a big role, at least 67% of humidity.
Which excludes a lot of people's houses.
The lower level of my house is pretty perfect for it. It's I live in a 3-level townhome, and the bottom level, it sits right on the ground, is very cool. And so I close all the blinds. My wife and everybody thinks I'm crazy. They think I work in the dark, but it's because I want to protect the wine. I care more about the wine than
humidity is an issue though here, because we have the internal heating, and we tend to have very dry internal air.
Yeah. Anyway, Gianluca, as an enophile, this topic fascinates me to no end. I could spend all day and probably all week discussing it with you. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on board and speak to us about it. Like I said, we'd love to have you on again to get a little bit more into detail about the consumption side of things and ask you a few more questions. Before I give it over to Bill, where can we find your new wine that you're going to be releasing this year?
It's going to be mostly direct to consumer. So you have my email. Feel free to share it, and it won't last long. I can tell you that.
I'll just make sure that one bottle goes to me, Gianluca.
You have a case set aside.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear. So if our clients want to acquire some wine, what's the contact region info?
So they can just shoot me a text, 226-450-2313 or gianlucadiloro@gmail.com.
Excellent. Alexander?
Bill?
Gianluca, I'm kind of angry because I'm down here in America and I'm not going to say hide nor hair of your wine. So, but thank you for your time. Very interesting discussion today. I am thirsty. It's about lunchtime. I know where I'm going to go. But before we get out of here, John and Alex, we've got Gianluca's contact information, but how do we get a hold of you if somebody's listening and wants to reach out?
Absolutely. So if anybody wants to reach out to us, they can send us an email at info@medwealth.ca. That's info@med-wealth.ca.
If you liked what you heard and you're not a subscriber, it's really easy. Hit the subscribe button down below. That way you won't forget. You won't have to remember where you found these guys. It gets delivered to your listening device. You're notified, and you won't miss an episode. On behalf of John and Alex Soutos, thank you very much for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. We ask that if you would, rate the podcast and share it with others, because in doing so, you let everybody else know about the podcast and they can join in on the fun. On behalf of everyone at MedWealth, I'm Bill Tucker. Thank you for listening and reminding you, don't wait. Live your best day today.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.